She woke up before the sun had fully risen, as she did every single day. The air inside the small servant room was still cold, and the thin blanket she used was not enough to keep her warm through the night. Outside, the mansion was still quiet. No footsteps, no voices, just the soft sound of wind moving through the tall trees that surrounded the large property. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes for a moment before folding her blanket neatly. Everything in her life had a routine. Wake up early, clean the floors, prepare rooms, serve meals, wash dishes, repeat the same cycle without interruption. There was no space for change, no room for questions, and no time for dreams. She walked quietly to the small wash area, careful not to make any noise that might disturb anyone in the house. The servants were expected to be invisible until they were needed. That was the rule. She washed her face with cold water, tied her hair back simply, and adjusted her uniform. It was plain and slightly faded, but clean. Cleanliness was the most important expectation in this house. By the time she stepped out, the sky had started to lighten. The mansion looked even larger in the early morning. Tall walls, polished windows, and perfectly trimmed gardens surrounded the building like a world completely separate from the life she had known before. Sometimes, she would pause for just a second and look at it all, wondering how different her life would have been if she stood on the other side of it. But she never stayed in thought for long. There was always work waiting. Inside the kitchen, other staff members were already busy preparing breakfast. The sound of utensils clinking filled the air. Steam rose from pots on the stove. The smell of freshly brewed tea and baked bread slowly spread through the room. No one spoke much. Everyone understood their roles without needing reminders. She joined quietly, helping wherever she was needed. She washed vegetables, wiped counters, and arranged dishes on trays. Her movements were careful and precise. Over time, she had learned how to move quickly without being noticed. That was how she survived in this place. Not by standing out, but by blending in completely. As the morning continued, the house slowly came to life. Doors opened upstairs. Footsteps echoed down hallways. Voices became louder. Guests were expected later in the day, so everything had to be perfect. There was a kind of pressure in the air that everyone could feel but no one openly spoke about. While cleaning one of the large living rooms, she paused for a moment near a corner where a grand piano stood. It was placed like a decoration more than an instrument. The black surface reflected light beautifully, untouched and polished. It looked expensive, powerful, and distant. She stared at it for just a second longer than she should have. A memory flashed in her mind, unwanted but sharp. She quickly turned away and continued wiping the table, trying to push the thought back down where it belonged. That piano did not belong in her world anymore. It belonged to a past she was no longer allowed to visit. Years ago, things had been different. She had once lived in a much smaller home, but it was filled with sound. Music had been part of her life in a way she could not even explain. There had been an old piano in that home too, worn out and slightly out of tune, but to her it had been something magical. She would sit for hours pressing keys, learning patterns, trying to understand how feelings could turn into sound. No one had taught her professionally. There were no lessons, no training, no formal guidance. Everything she knew came from curiosity and long hours of practice when no one was watching. Music had been her comfort, her escape, and her only place of freedom. But life had not been kind enough to let that continue. Financial struggles had slowly taken over everything. Responsibilities grew heavier. Choices became smaller. And at some point, survival became more important than dreams. The piano was the first thing to go. Then came everything else that was unnecessary for living. She still remembered the day she left it behind. She did not cry loudly. She did not protest. She simply stood in silence, watching as it was sold away. It felt like something inside her had been quietly locked away that day, never to be opened again. After that, she worked different jobs, each one harder than the last, until she eventually found herself working in this mansion. At first, it had seemed like stability, a place to earn enough to survive, a place where she would not have to worry about tomorrow. But over time, she realized it was also a place where she would be seen less and less as a person. Here she was not asked about her past. No one cared what she liked or what she had once dreamed of becoming. She was simply part of the background, like furniture that moved when needed. By mid-morning, the house was fully active. Guests were expected in a few hours. The atmosphere shifted from quiet routine to controlled preparation. Floors were polished again even if they were already clean. Curtains were adjusted. Tables were set with perfect alignment. Every detail mattered. She moved from room to room carrying out instructions. Sometimes she would pass by mirrors and catch a glimpse of herself, but she rarely looked for long. She did not recognize the version of herself that stood there. That woman in the reflection looked tired, quiet, and distant. Not someone with a past full of music. While arranging items in the main hall, she overheard fragments of conversation from the upper floor. Guests would be arriving soon, important people, people who expected entertainment and perfection. The mansion always transformed during such visits. It became less of a home and more of a stage. She kept her head down and focused on her work. That was the safest way to get through the day. But deep inside, something unsettled remained. It was not loud. It was not demanding. It was just a small feeling she had learned to ignore over the years. A feeling that sometimes, in very quiet moments, reminded her of something she once loved more than anything else. She tried to push it away again. There was no place for it here. Not in this house. Not in this life. Still, as she passed the living room once more, her eyes accidentally drifted toward the piano again. This time, she looked away faster, but the image stayed longer in her mind. Not as an object, but as a memory. A memory she had buried deep, yet somehow still alive. She tightened her grip on the cloth in her hands and continued walking. The day was not over yet, and there was still too much work to be done. But somewhere beneath the silence she had built around herself, something faint had already begun to stir again, waiting for a moment she did not yet know was coming. The afternoon light slowly spread across the mansion, turning the wide windows golden. Everything inside looked brighter now, but the calm feeling of early morning had disappeared. The house was no longer quiet. Voices moved through the halls. Footsteps echoed from upstairs. Doors opened and closed more often. The place felt alive in a controlled way, like everything was carefully prepared for something important. She continued her work without stopping. By now, her hands had already done more tasks than she could count. She had cleaned rooms, arranged furniture, carried trays, and helped in the kitchen again when needed. There was no fixed job for her during busy days. She simply went where she was called, without question, without delay. But even while working, her mind was not fully calm. Every time she passed the living room, she felt that same small pull inside her chest. It was not strong enough to stop her, but it was enough to disturb her thoughts for a second. The piano was still there, standing silently in the corner, untouched and polished. It almost looked like it belonged to a different world inside the house, a world she was not allowed to enter. She avoided it as much as she could. Still, the memory refused to stay buried completely. As she carried a tray toward the dining area, her steps slowed slightly, and for a brief moment, her thoughts drifted back to a time she rarely allowed herself to remember. There was a time when her life had sound in it. Not the sound of dishes or footsteps or doors opening, but something different, something softer, something meaningful. She had once lived in a small home where evenings were calm and simple. There had been no luxury, no large halls, no servants or guests. Just a small space where life moved slowly. In one corner of that home stood an old piano. It was not perfect. Some keys were slightly out of tune. The wood had scratches. But to her, it had never been just an object. It had been her world. As a child, she used to sit in front of it for hours. At first, she would press random keys, simply curious about how each sound felt. Over time, she began to notice patterns. Certain notes together created feelings she could not explain. Some combinations felt calm. Others felt bright. And some made her feel deeply emotional, even without words. No one had formally taught her. She never attended a music school. She never had proper lessons. Everything she learned came from patience and curiosity. She would listen carefully, repeat sounds, and try again and again until it felt right. There were nights when she stayed awake longer than she should have, quietly practicing while the rest of the house slept. It was the only time she felt truly free. When her fingers touched the keys, she felt like she could be something more than her surroundings. Sometimes she would imagine playing in front of people. Not for attention, but simply to share something beautiful. Something real. But those thoughts always stayed inside her mind. She never spoke about them out loud. Life around her did not leave much space for dreams like that. Her family had always struggled with money. Every decision in the house was shaped by necessity. Food, rent, daily expenses, everything mattered more than personal interests. As she grew older, responsibilities increased. There was less time for imagination and more need for survival. Slowly, the piano became something she visited less often. At first, she told herself it was temporary, that she would return to it when things became easier. But life rarely becomes easier on its own. Instead, responsibilities kept growing, and time kept shrinking. Eventually, the piano stopped being part of her daily life. And then came the hardest part. There was a point when keeping it was no longer possible. It was not a dramatic moment. There were no arguments, no loud emotions. Just a quiet decision made out of necessity. Something had to go, and the piano was the only thing that could be let go. She remembered standing in the room as it was taken away. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply watched as something that once meant everything to her slowly disappeared from her life. That moment stayed with her longer than she ever admitted. After that, life changed completely. She moved from place to place, taking whatever work was available. Some days were easier than others, but none of them ever felt the same as before. Music was no longer part of her world. It became something distant, something she only thought about when she was alone. Until this mansion. When she first arrived here, she did not notice the piano immediately. It was placed in the main living room, but she was too focused on learning her duties to pay attention to details. Days passed before she truly saw it. And when she did, something inside her shifted in a way she could not explain. At first, she thought it was just a coincidence. Many wealthy houses had musical instruments for decoration. It meant nothing. At least that is what she told herself. But the feeling did not go away. Now, every time she walked past it, she felt something familiar stirring inside her. Something she had kept locked away for years. It was not loud. It did not demand attention. It simply existed, quietly waiting. She tried to ignore it. And most of the time she succeeded. But not completely. Later in the afternoon, while the staff prepared the final arrangements for the guests, she was assigned to clean the main hall again. It was already clean, but perfection was expected. Every surface had to shine. Every corner had to look flawless. She worked carefully, moving from one side of the room to the other. The mansion was now fully prepared for the evening gathering. Important guests were expected, and everything had to be perfect. While dusting near the center table, she heard distant conversations from upstairs. Laughter, instructions, reminders. Everything felt organized but tense at the same time. She kept working quietly, but then something happened that slightly changed the rhythm of her day. A few guests arrived earlier than expected. Their voices entered the house before they did. The staff quickly adjusted, making final preparations. The atmosphere shifted again, becoming more alert, more controlled. She stepped aside as people moved through the hall. And that was when one of them noticed the piano. It was a casual comment at first. A light remark spoken without much thought. But it reached her ears clearly. A few people glanced toward the instrument. Someone made a small joke about it. Another mentioned that it had never been played during gatherings. It was just there, unused like a decorative piece. She kept her head down, continuing her work, pretending not to hear. But inside, something tightened slightly. Not anger, not sadness. Something more complicated. It was a feeling she had not allowed herself to face for a long time. A feeling that reminded her of who she used to be. She finished cleaning and stepped away from the area, moving toward the corridor. Her pace was steady, but her thoughts were not. For the first time that day, she did not fully push the memory away. It stayed with her, quiet, unshaken, waiting. The evening was slowly arriving, and the mansion had already transformed into something different from the morning. Everything looked more polished, more controlled, and more serious. Soft golden lights were turned on in every corner, making the wide halls shine like a stage prepared for an important event. The staff moved faster now, not in panic, but in quiet pressure, as if every second mattered. She was still working, as she always did when guests were expected. Her tasks had shifted again. Now she was helping in the final arrangements of the main hall. Chairs were adjusted carefully. Tables were checked again and again. Glasses were placed in perfect alignment. Even the smallest detail had to look correct. There was no space for mistakes in this house when important people arrived. She moved quietly from one corner to another, doing everything without being noticed. That had become her natural way of living here. If she was seen too much, it usually meant something was wrong. The mansion was now filled with a different kind of energy. Earlier in the day, it had felt like preparation. Now it felt like expectation. Everyone was waiting for the arrival of guests. Conversations were short. Movements were careful. Even the sound of footsteps seemed softer, as if the house itself was trying to stay respectful. She paused for a moment near the edge of the hall, looking at everything she had helped prepare. The room looked beautiful. The lighting, the arrangement, the polished floor. It all looked like something out of a perfect picture. But she did not feel part of it. She felt like someone standing outside a painting, allowed to see it but not belong inside it. A few staff members passed by her, carrying trays and decorations. No one spoke much. They exchanged quick looks, small nods, and continued working. Everyone knew their roles too well to waste time in conversation. She adjusted one of the table covers that had slightly moved out of place. Her hands worked automatically, trained by repetition. But even as she worked, her attention kept drifting toward the living room area. The piano was still there. It always seemed to be there. Silent. Still. Untouched. She avoided looking at it directly, but she could feel its presence. It was like something in the room that did not move, yet still pulled attention without trying. The memory of earlier comments from the guests still lingered in her mind. It had not been harsh or direct. It had been casual, almost careless. But somehow that made it worse, because it showed how little people thought of it, and maybe how little they thought of anyone connected to it. She tightened her grip on the cloth in her hand and continued working. The hall was almost ready now. Chairs were perfectly placed in rows. The front area was cleared for speeches or performances. Everything looked prepared for something important. She stepped back slightly, checking her work like she had been taught. Then she moved toward the side corridor to fetch something else needed for the final setup. As she walked, the sound of voices from the entrance grew louder. The guests were starting to arrive. It began slowly at first. A few voices, then more footsteps, then the opening of large doors. The staff immediately straightened their posture. Movements became sharper, more precise. Everyone knew the arrival phase required full attention. She stopped near the corridor wall, waiting for instructions. From where she stood, she could see glimpses of the entrance hall. People were entering in groups, dressed neatly, speaking confidently. Their presence changed the atmosphere instantly. The mansion that had felt like a workplace moments ago now felt like a completely different world. She kept her gaze low, as she always did in these situations. Her job was simple. Stay out of the way, assist when needed, and remain invisible unless called. But tonight felt slightly different. There was more energy in the air than usual. More attention. More expectation. She did not understand why, but something about this gathering felt heavier than others. As guests continued to arrive, conversations grew louder in the hall. Laughter echoed. Greetings were exchanged. The space slowly filled with movement and life. It was like watching a carefully arranged system come alive. She was called once to bring extra glassware from the kitchen. She moved quickly, returned without delay, and placed everything where instructed. Then she stepped back again. While passing through the main hall, she noticed more people gathering near the center. Some were standing close to the piano now. A few were talking about it casually. She did not stop, but her steps slowed slightly. One of the guests made another light comment about the instrument. Something about it being unused. Another person replied with a small laugh. It was nothing serious. Just small talk. But for her, it felt heavier than it should have. She kept walking. Still, something inside her remained unsettled. Later, she was assigned to assist near the dining area again. She helped serve drinks, move trays, and responded to quick instructions. Everything was happening faster now. The house was fully active, filled with voices, movement, and energy. But even in the middle of all this activity, her mind kept returning to the same thing. The piano. She tried to focus on her work. She really did. But memories have a way of returning when least expected. She remembered how it felt to sit in front of keys that responded to her touch. How even simple notes could feel like they carried emotion. How, in those moments, nothing else mattered. That version of her felt far away now, almost like another person entirely. She shook her thoughts away and continued working. The guests were now fully settled. The hall was almost at capacity. Conversations filled the space, blending into a constant background sound. The atmosphere was formal but lively. She was standing near the side again when a small moment caught her attention. A group of guests had gathered closer to the piano. Not many, but enough to draw focus. One of them leaned slightly forward, looking at it more carefully. Another made a comment that seemed half curious, half amused. She could not hear every word clearly, but she understood the tone. It was not respect. It was not admiration. It was casual judgment. Like the piano was simply an object that had no purpose. She stood still for a moment longer than she should have. Then she turned away. But something inside her did not turn away so easily. The words were simple. The situation was small. But the feeling it created inside her was not small at all. It was something she had avoided for years. A quiet reminder that what she once loved had become something forgotten by the world around her. She walked back toward the corridor, trying to steady her thoughts. But as she moved, she felt something different beginning to rise inside her. Not loud, not clear, just a feeling she could not fully ignore anymore. It was still buried, but not as deep as before. And for the first time in a long time, she did not push it down immediately. She simply kept walking, carrying that feeling with her into the growing noise of the evening, unaware that something in the coming moments was about to change the course of everything she thought she had already left behind. The mansion was now fully alive with voices, lights, and movement. The evening gathering had reached its peak, and every corner of the large hall was filled with guests talking, laughing, and enjoying the atmosphere. The soft music playing in the background added to the elegance of the event, but it did not reach every corner of the hall. Most of the attention remained on conversations, greetings, and social exchanges. She stood near the side corridor, waiting for the next instruction. Her role had not changed much throughout the evening. She had moved between rooms, carried items when needed, and helped wherever the staff required extra hands. It was a busy night, but she had learned how to handle such pressure without drawing attention. That was her strength now, working quietly, efficiently, and without disturbance. Still, something about this evening felt slightly different. There was a subtle tension in the air. Not fear or panic, but expectation. As if something important was about to happen, even though no one had clearly said it. She could feel it in the way people spoke a little more carefully, in the way staff moved a little faster, and in the way the main hall had been arranged with extra attention. She tried to ignore it and focus on her work, but her thoughts kept drifting. Every time she passed near the main hall, her eyes naturally moved toward the piano. It was still in its place, standing silently near the corner like it had been for years. But tonight, it felt more visible than usual, more present, almost like it was part of the evening in a way she could not explain. She avoided looking at it directly. Instead, she kept her head down and continued her duties. At one point, she was asked to assist with serving drinks to a small group of guests. She moved carefully through the crowd, balancing the tray with steady hands. Conversations surrounded her, overlapping voices filled with stories, opinions, and laughter. No one paid attention to her presence, and she preferred it that way. While moving between tables, she caught small fragments of conversation. People were discussing business, travel, events, and daily life. Everything sounded distant to her, like it belonged to another world. She kept walking, placing drinks where needed, and stepping back without waiting for acknowledgement. But as she returned toward the side of the hall, something unexpected happened. A few guests had gathered closer to the piano. This time, it was not just casual distance or passing comments. They were standing near it, looking at it more directly. One of them had even placed a hand lightly on the edge of it, as if inspecting it. She slowed her steps slightly as she passed. Not enough to stop, but enough to notice. A few words reached her ears again. Something about the piano being unused. Someone else mentioned how it had probably been there only for decoration. A small laugh followed. Nothing harsh, nothing intentional, just casual remarks. But those words stayed with her longer than they should have. She continued walking, trying to ignore it. Still, a strange heaviness settled inside her chest. She did not understand why something so small affected her so much. She had heard worse things before in life. She had ignored more difficult situations. Yet something about this felt different. It was not about the words themselves. It was about what they meant. She kept moving, but her steps felt slightly slower now. Later in the evening, the main hall became even more crowded. More guests had arrived. The energy of the room had increased. Conversations blended together into a steady background sound. The atmosphere felt lively, but controlled. She was asked to stand near the side entrance to assist with coordination. She followed instructions without question. From where she stood, she had a clear view of most of the hall. She could see the guests, the staff, and the carefully arranged space. Everything looked perfect from the outside. Every detail had been planned, every arrangement checked. It was the kind of environment where everything appeared flawless. But she no longer saw it that way. She saw the small movements behind perfection, the constant adjustments, the quiet pressure on the staff, the effort it took to maintain the illusion of ease. It reminded her that nothing here was truly effortless. While standing there, she noticed a shift in attention near the center of the hall. A small group of guests had gathered closer to the piano again. This time, more people were looking in that direction. It was not loud or dramatic. It was subtle curiosity, like something had caught their attention without warning. She did not move closer, but she watched from a distance. One of the guests made another comment, slightly louder this time. A few heads turned. Another person responded with a small smile. The piano had become a point of focus, even if briefly. She felt something tighten inside her again. She did not understand why it affected her so much. It was just an object, just a piano, but her mind refused to treat it that way. She remembered how it used to feel to be near something like that. Not in this house, not in this life, but long ago, when she had no responsibilities beyond herself. When her world was smaller but somehow felt more real. She pushed the thought away again. She had learned how to do that over the years. Ignore, continue, survive. But tonight, it was harder than usual. At one point, she was asked to assist near the piano area itself. She hesitated for only a second before moving forward. She was told to help adjust the seating arrangement nearby, as more guests were expected to gather there for the next part of the evening. She followed the instruction. As she walked closer, she could feel her awareness increase. Every step felt slightly heavier, not because of fear but because of memory. A memory she had kept locked away for a long time. She kept her eyes lowered. She did not look at the piano directly, but she could feel it, as if it was waiting. She adjusted the chairs carefully, making sure everything was aligned properly. Her hands moved automatically, trained by experience. But her mind was not fully present, kept drifting. She finished the task and stepped back slightly. That was when it happened. A guest, standing nearby, made a casual remark and gestured toward the piano. It was not directed at her. It was part of a general conversation. Something light. Something meant to be harmless. But in that moment, something shifted inside her. She froze for just a second. Not visibly. Not in a way others would notice. But internally something stopped. Her thoughts became still. Her attention narrowed. She did not move forward or backward. She simply stood there. A quiet pause in the middle of noise. Her hands, which had been steady all evening, felt slightly different now. Not weak. Not shaking. Just different. Like they had remembered something her mind had tried to forget. She slowly lowered her gaze further. And for the first time that evening, she did not immediately walk away from the feeling inside her. She stayed still for a moment longer than she should have. Then, very slowly, she stepped back into the side corridor. But something had already changed. Not in the room. Not in the guests. Not in the piano. Something had changed in her. And she did not fully understand it yet. She stepped into the side corridor slowly, as if the air inside the hall had suddenly become heavier than before. The noise of the gathering still reached her. Soft laughter, glasses clinking, distant conversations. But it now felt far away, like she was hearing it through water. Her mind, however, was not with the crowd anymore. It stayed behind, near the piano. She stopped walking for a moment, placing one hand lightly against the wall for balance. Not because she was weak, but because her thoughts felt crowded all at once. It was strange. The evening had been busy, loud, and full of movement. Yet this small moment had made everything inside her feel still. She tried to breathe normally, but her attention kept pulling her back. She had seen the piano many times before during her work here. She had passed it, cleaned near it, ignored it. It had always been just part of the room. An object. Something expensive but unused. Something that belonged to the house, not to her. But tonight something had shifted. She did not fully understand what it was. It was not just the comments from the guests. Not just the looks or casual words. It was something deeper. Something she had not allowed herself to feel in years. A memory that had not stayed in the past like it was supposed to. She closed her eyes briefly. And suddenly, she was not in the mansion anymore. She was somewhere else. A smaller place. Quieter. Simpler. A time when life did not feel so structured and controlled. She could almost hear it again. Not the voices of guests or staff, but something softer. Something that did not belong to this world she was in now. Music. It was faint at first, like it was coming from far away inside her memory. Then slowly it became clearer. The feeling of sitting in front of keys. The quiet room. The moments when she had nothing else to think about except sound and rhythm. Her fingers in that memory had not felt heavy. They had felt free. She opened her eyes again quickly, as if afraid the memory might pull her too far away. Back in the corridor, the sounds of the mansion returned fully. She was there again, standing near the wall. A worker in a large house. Nothing more. But something inside her did not fully return with her. It stayed behind in that memory for a few seconds longer. She pushed herself to move again, walking slowly further down the corridor. Her steps were controlled, but not as steady as before. She had done this many times in her life. Move forward, ignore thoughts, continue working. That was how she had survived everything until now. But tonight it felt harder. She reached a small service area and paused again. Other staff members were passing by quickly, carrying items, speaking in short instructions, focused on their duties. No one paid attention to her, and she was grateful for that. She tried to refocus. There was still work to be done. The event was not over. But even as she tried to think about tasks, her mind kept slipping back. The piano was still there. Not physically in front of her now, but in her thoughts. Clearer than before. Not just as an object, but as something that had meaning she had refused to acknowledge. She remembered how her fingers used to move without fear. How mistakes did not feel like failure but like learning. How time would disappear when she sat in front of it. It had not been a luxury for her back then. It had been a need. Something that made everything else in life easier to carry. She slowly lowered her head, staring at the floor for a moment. It was confusing. She had not thought about that part of her life in so long that it almost felt like it belonged to someone else. Someone she used to know but had not seen in years. Yet it was still inside her. Still there. Just buried. A staff member called her name softly from a distance, pulling her back to the present. She quickly responded, straightening herself and moving toward the instruction. There was no time to get lost in thoughts. Not here. Not now. She helped carry a small tray of items back toward the main hall. As she walked, the sound of the gathering became louder again. She could see people moving, talking, enjoying the evening. Everything looked normal on the surface, but she no longer felt fully part of it. She placed the tray where it was needed and stepped aside again. That was when she noticed something different. The piano area was no longer just a background part of the hall. More people had gathered near it now. Not a large crowd, but enough to make it noticeable. Some were standing closer than before. Others were looking in that direction while talking. The attention had slowly shifted toward that corner of the room. She stopped at the edge of the hall, watching quietly from a distance. Something was happening, even if no one was clearly announcing it. A few guests were speaking with more interest now. Their tone had changed slightly. What had been casual earlier was now becoming more focused. She could not hear every word, but she could sense the shift in energy. It was no longer just decoration. It was becoming a point of curiosity. She felt her chest tighten slightly again, but she did not move away immediately this time. Instead, she stayed where she was, watching, not fully understanding why. The piano sat there as always, silent, still, waiting. She had passed it so many times that it had become invisible in her daily routine. But tonight it was refusing to stay invisible. It was becoming something she could not ignore anymore. Her hands tightened slightly at her sides. Not in fear, not in anger, just awareness. A feeling she could not name properly. A few steps away, a guest made a light comment, and others responded with small reactions. It was not dramatic. It was not loud, but it reached her clearly, and for a moment, she felt something rise inside her again. Not a memory this time, something closer to emotion. She swallowed slightly and looked away for a second, but then she looked back, and stayed looking longer than she had before. She did not move forward. She did not move back. She just stood there, quietly, as the room continued to fill with voices and attention slowly gathering toward that single object. Inside her, something was no longer fully silent. It was still small, still hidden, but it had started to wake up. The evening had reached its final stage, but the mansion still felt full of life. The guests were still talking, though their voices had softened compared to earlier. The energy in the room had changed slightly. It was no longer just about conversation or enjoyment. There was now a sense that something different was about to happen. She stood near the side of the hall, where the light was softer and the movement around her was less intense. Her duties had slowed for the moment, but she had not fully stopped working. In a place like this, even standing still meant staying alert. She kept her posture steady, her expression calm, and her presence quiet, as always. But inside, she was not fully calm. Something had stayed with her since earlier. It had not gone away. The piano, that silent object in the corner of the hall, now felt different to her. Not because it had changed, but because something inside her had changed. She had spent years treating it like background furniture. Something rich people owned but never truly used. Something that had no connection to her life. But now it did. And that thought made her uneasy in a way she could not explain. She tried to focus on the present again. The hall was still active. Guests were still present. Staff still moved carefully between groups, ensuring everything remained perfect. The event was not over yet, and she still had responsibilities. But her attention kept slipping. Every few seconds, her eyes drifted toward the piano without permission from her own mind. It stood there in its usual place, still silent, still untouched, but now it felt like it was waiting. That idea made no sense to her, yet it stayed. A small group of guests had gathered near it again. Their voices were a bit more focused now. Not loud but clearer. They were no longer treating it like decoration. There was curiosity in their tone, something that felt like expectation forming slowly. She noticed a staff member walking toward that area, adjusting chairs slightly, preparing the space. And then it happened. A guest made a comment, louder than before, something that sounded like a suggestion. Another person responded with interest. A few heads turned. The attention in that part of the room grew stronger. She did not hear every word clearly, but she understood enough. Something was being asked. Something about the piano. She felt her body become still without realizing it. This time, she did not move away immediately. She stayed, watching. The piano was no longer just a background object. It had become the center of attention for a small but growing part of the room. Even people who were not standing close were now looking in that direction. The staff seemed slightly unsure, but they continued preparing the area as instructed. And then the moment came. A gentle pressure in the room changed the atmosphere. Not from force, not from command, but from expectation. Someone near the front of the group turned slightly and spoke again, this time with a tone that felt more direct. Heads turned toward the side of the hall. And slowly, almost naturally, attention began to shift toward her. First, she did not understand. She thought it was accidental. She looked around slightly, expecting someone else behind her. But there was no one else in that exact position. The direction of their gaze was clear. It was her. A quiet silence formed in that part of the room. Not complete silence, but enough to feel different. She felt her breath pause slightly. Her mind tried to make sense of it quickly. But before she could fully process what was happening, another guest spoke softly, almost casually, but clearly enough. The suggestion was simple. They wanted to hear the piano played. Her eyes widened just slightly, but she controlled her expression quickly. Years of working in this environment had taught her how to hide reactions. Still, inside, something shifted sharply. She was not a performer. She was not a guest. She was staff. A worker. Someone who cleaned, served, and stayed in the background. Not someone who sat at a piano in front of everyone. She felt her feet stay firmly planted where she stood. For a moment, she did not move. The room did not rush her. There was no loud demand. No harsh pressure. But there was expectation. Quiet, steady expectation. She looked toward the piano again without meaning to. Felt closer now. Not physically, but emotionally. Like it had suddenly become connected to her in a way she had avoided for years. She lowered her gaze quickly. Her thoughts became crowded. She had not played in a long time. Not even alone. Not even for herself. That part of her life had been left behind so completely that she sometimes wondered if it had even been real. But now, in front of all these people, that forgotten part of her was being pulled into the present. She felt a strange conflict inside her. A part of her wanted to step back, to refuse, to disappear into the corridor again, to continue being invisible. That was safer. That was familiar. But another part of her stayed still, not moving away, not agreeing, just present. She did not speak. She did not respond. Her silence became noticeable in the room, but no one interrupted it. The guests waited, not impatiently, but expectantly. She slowly lifted her eyes again, and for the first time that evening, she looked directly at the piano. It did not feel like an object anymore. Felt like a moment, a choice forming in real time. Her hands remained still at her sides. Her heart felt heavier than usual, but not in a painful way. More like pressure building from inside, something she had held back for too long. She took a small breath. No one spoke. No one moved. The room was watching, but not in a harsh way. It was more like curiosity mixed with anticipation. Even the staff had paused slightly, unsure of what would happen next. She finally took one step forward. Then another. Slowly. Carefully. Not rushed. Not confident. Just moving. Every step felt like it carried memory with it. Every step felt like it crossed a boundary she had not crossed in years. She reached the piano. She stopped. For a moment, she simply stood there. looking at it, her reflection faintly visible on its polished surface. The room behind her felt distant now. The sounds faded slightly in her awareness. It was just her. And the piano. She hesitated. Her hand lifted slightly, then stopped. Then slowly, finally, she placed her fingers gently above the keys. Not pressing yet. Just resting. A pause so quiet it felt like time itself was waiting. The room did not interrupt. No one spoke. She took one more breath. And then, she pressed the first key. A single note filled the hall. Soft, clear, unexpected. And in that moment, something inside her that had been silent for years began to respond.